was very keen to teach other people about how so that they should avoid errors. Use a clear, logical workbook structure. Use a clear, clean, consistent design. Write instructions for the users. If it's a tool which is going to be used and regularly updated, you need to make sure the users know how to use it. There's no worry that Excel is going to die anytime soon. So when you're developing any calculation, you need to be aware, do you understand what it is that you're modeling? I invented the Warren Buffett rule of modeling. So Warren Buffett's famous rule of investing is only invest in what you understand. And I amended that for modeling to say only model what you understand. So I am a big fan of macros, but not for calculations. I use macros for things like if you need to create an output sheet which needs to be uploaded to the system, then click on the button, it just creates the sheet in the CSV format that the upload system needs, and then that's it. Certainly getting trained early. Not try and learn it yourself, but take some formal training course so you can learn.
Welcome to Financial Modeler's Corner, where we discuss the art and science of financial modeling with your host, Paul Barnhurst. Financial Modeler's Corner is sponsored by Financial Modeling Institute. Welcome to Financial Modeler's Corner. I am your host, Paul Barnhurst. In this podcast, we talk all about the art and science of financial modeling with distinguished financial modelers from around the globe. Financial Modeler's Corner podcast is brought to you by the Financial Modeling Institute. FMI offers the most respected accreditations in financial modeling. I'm thrilled to welcome this week's guest to the show, Gary Knott. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Really excited to have you. As you know, we start every episode with this question. I know you've heard a few. Tell me that horror story. What's that worst model you've seen in your career?
In preparing for this, two came to mind, if I may mention two. So one was where the calculations and the inputs and the outputs hadn't been clearly separated. So in the outputs, in the profit and loss account and the balance sheet, there were calculations, lots of calculations, and including adding in the inflation. So it was a great big mess. So if you looked in the sales line, you could see a very complicated calculation there because you only had room in one line to do all the calculations you wanted to do, including inflation. So it was just terrible to follow. So there I would very much
imagine that would be a mess to follow.
Mention the best practice rule, always split your inputs, your calculations and your outputs into separate sheets. And the other one I had was a complex project planning model, which was used for each new project planning. And I had the impression that each time a new user took over the model and had to use it for the new project, and they were probably afraid to delete any content because they weren't sure what it was for, so they just added in new content. And if they wanted an input, they linked it back to the input from the last time, which was then linked back to the input from the previous time, and you got these daisy chains. So to trace it back to where was the original input made, that was a bit of a struggle. Yeah, so that's not best practice. Obviously, try and reduce the content so that it matches the purpose.
Yeah, no, there's something to be said when you get the I link it here, then I link that back to there, then that one goes back to there, and you're like, okay, all 6 of those could have been linked to one place. Why am I having to trace it out to figure out where it started?
Exactly. So that's what I always recommend, trying to link back particularly inputs to the original input and not use these what are sometimes called daisy chains.
Yeah, no, we've definitely seen some daisy chains, and they're a pain to review. I'm sure I've done a few over my career, but I try not to.
Yeah.
So why don't you go ahead and tell us about yourself and your background? Just let the audience know your story.
Yeah, so I started at Deloitte, or in England, Touche Ross, they were called that time, and I found it great. And then there was one client that said they needed some help with Excel modeling, and they asked around in the Deloitte team, who's good at Excel? It's all Gary's good at Excel. He can do that. So I went along and I found it amazing. Yeah, it's really great. I hadn't learned any financial modeling best practice rules, but I could see what they already had a team there, but it was just they had too many projects on, so they wanted to have extra capacity. So I went along there and helped them with that, and I really got into it. I really liked it, and I thought this is what I want to do. And so then I later joined the financial modeling department at Deloitte, And after a number of successful years there, I decided to set up on my own. So from 2015, I've now, 9 years now, been successfully doing financial modeling and Excel tools and data analysis and training as an independent person. Yeah. I have 2 employees, so they support me, but it's great. So I have my little office here. I'm based, well, I originally come from England. I'm living and working in Germany. I met my wife, she's German. So based in Germany, and out of a small office, we can service clients around the world. Great.
Well, congratulations on starting your own business. I know that's always a big step, and I'm glad it's going well and you're loving what you're doing. But I'm curious. So you started at Deloitte, but you studied, if I remember right, you studied physics and math in college.
Correct.
How did you end up being a finance and accounting person? How did that happen? Tell me that story.
I guess I basically a bit fell into it. I mean, I've always been interested in and good at maths. I did have a short stint at the Her Majesty's Customs and Excise in England as a VAT inspector. So there I got to learn about double entry bookkeeping. But some stage I realized that really wasn't what I wanted to do long term. I looked around and someone suggested, look, with maths, you can study and become a chartered accountant. So I had to look at that. And first of all, you got 3 years of study and work combined. So it was hard, but I decided to have a go at that. And I decided right from the first day, that was for me. Working in accountancy, gives you a very good training. So you get to go around different clients and you get to understand different business models and the way different businesses operate, different processes, and also different personalities. So that was a very good background. And then based upon that, I then moved into the modeling team and was just doing the modeling. So that was great.
Got it. So it sounds like you had one job that did a little bit with accounting, and that led to getting more interest in taking the accounting route to move from math and physics to the accounting world.
Correct. And I always remember double entry bookkeeping. That's it's hard to learn, first of all, but once you've learned it, it stands you in good stead. You can always go back to that. And if I want to understand a process so that I can correctly model it in a model, that really helps, knowing, okay, what the two sides of this transaction. Okay, sales goes up and the debtors go up. And it also helps when you're trying to sense check a model, okay, when certain figures are moving, then certain other figures should be moving as well.
Yep. Having that foundation of accounting, double entry bookkeeping, and the interactions between the different financial statements is really critical, so that you can look at it and go, okay, cash is way up, but my accounts receivable is down, my accounts payable is down. You start wondering, okay, what's going on? Did I raise capital? And you could start to just understand those interactions and go, okay, there has to be a reason for this. If I don't see it, then there's probably something broke in my model. I did something wrong here.
Yeah, either that or it's something you didn't understand. You've got the aha effect. Yes, of course. When that happens, then that happens. And then that has this impact. Yeah. So that also
sometimes it's, definitely. Sometimes it's something you did totally wrong in the model, formula, whatever. And sometimes it's a lack of understanding and you need to rewire some things and some assumptions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or you get a deeper understanding of how things, what the effects are of certain changes.
Yeah, no, I'm totally with you on that. So you wrote a book.
Correct.
And the title, make sure I got this right, Avoid Excel Horror Stories. Yes, I see it there. Avoid Excel Horror Stories. We all have them.
Yes.
So how did the book come about? Let's start there.
Yeah, so I was in the business modeling department at Deloitte and looking at other colleagues' models or client models. Sometimes we were doing model reviews and seeing a lot of times this is terrible or this is not good. There must be a better way of doing it. And through that, I gradually learned these best practice rules that, for example, you separate the inputs, the calculations, and the outputs. So that kind of thing, and structuring it clearly and consistently, those kind of things appeared obvious to me. So I think I'd already worked those out for myself. But certain other tips, like having a master check sheet, that was something I had to learn and implement in my daily doing. And then it became a bit of a something that I was very keen to teach other people about, so that they should avoid errors. So I introduced my Gary's Golden Ground Rules, so GGG, Gary's Golden Rules, and I taught people about those in the training courses that I gave internally. And then when I left Deloitte, I was very pleased to receive a glass plaque with my, at that time, 3 golden rules engraved upon it. So that was a very nice leaving present.
What were the 3 golden rules at that point? I'm curious, what were they?
Yeah, one of them was, which is no longer golden rule, it's more of a principle, which is work smarter, not harder.
Love it. What's the other 2?
So the other 2, I should have prepared for that.
It's totally fine.
I should have seen. I wanted to dig out the plaque and show it to you. But anyway, yeah, so there were things like, I think the other 2 were, yes, that was the other one. Consistency is key. That was one. So I'm still very big fan of consistency is key. I think of all the rules there are, that's the one, if you follow that one, that can bring you a long way in terms of getting a reliable model. So that means making sure the columns are consistent. So if you're building a financial model and the year 2024 is in column F on one sheet, it should be in column F on all of the sheets. And why does that matter? Because when you've got a formula which is referring to another sheet, you can then copy the formula across to the right. And if all the columns are consistent, then you shouldn't have any linkage errors. You're linking to the wrong column. So that's very important. And not just consistency of the columns, consistency of, for example, the rows. So if you have a block, that's the profit and loss account for company A with this structure, then that structure should be used for all of the different entities which you're depicting. So that just makes it a lot easier for you to develop. You develop it once and then copy and paste it, and obviously you have to change the links. But it's consistent look and feel. It just makes it easy for you to develop and quicker. And once you've tested it once, you know it works, you can copy it across and be more reliable in the other entities. And for a user, it's great. Once they've understood it once, they can understand all of the P&Ls. They know the structure. They know where they're coming from. And then when you're doing the consolidation, you just add through all the sheets and you know you can copy the formulas down or across because the structure is the same. Yeah. So it's, that's my number 1 tip. I think consistency is key.
That is a huge one. And, the example that was running through my head is I did FP&A. So there are times you might have 50 cost centers and you want to make sure every one of those sheets is the same. So when you roll it all up, you don't have issues, right? If you have different accounts on different rows, that becomes a nightmare. You just really can't do it. No. Totally agree with you on that consistency. And I love how you mentioned, across the columns too. It makes your formulas easier. It also makes it a lot easier for somebody to audit.
Correct. Yes.
January 2024 is always in column C on every page versus it's C here and it's D here and it's F there. Occasionally there may be a page because you have different schedules that you may need to do something a little different for whatever reason. But as a general rule, it should be consistent throughout the model.
Correct. What I have seen sometimes, which I have delivered, is on some sheets you need more columns at the front so you can do some ifs or whatever. And then, but thereafter, maybe 2 or 3 columns offset, but then it's still consistent thereafter. So you can still link from C to F and then copy it across. It's still correctly linked.
Yeah, what you shouldn't do I'll often do is add the extra columns on every sheet so that even if they're not using one, it's just kind of the same.
Yes, that's a good tip. Yeah, so add in blank columns and make them a narrow width. You've got consistency of columns. Exactly, that's a great tip there.
So you had mentioned the 3 golden rules, but I know in the book, I believe you have some more. So maybe talk about what's your list of rules now? What are the ground rules today?
Yes. Yeah. So the ground rules are, the first 3 cover the structure of the workbook, and then the other 2 are access and understanding. So the first 3 are use a clear, logical workbook structure. What does that mean? It means decide what worksheets you need. And get them in order and give them clear names. So no rocket science, but just to make it clear. So you've got clarity and the users have clarity. And I often put a separator sheet between each of these sections. So this is inputs, this is calculations, this is outputs, or whatever they happen to be.
I do that type of thing with a lot of models, my divider or separator sheets. I'll usually highlight them in red, make the entire worksheet black, and it's just to separate the rest of the model.
Yes, correct. And I usually put after the sheet name a greater than symbol, which means it's like an arrow to the right, just to show the sheets to the right.
I do the same type of thing.
And sometimes I split the inputs into transaction data and master data if that's warranted. Okay, so that's the first one. The next one is, so that's the workbook. So the sheets in the workbook, and then looking at each individual sheet, keep your worksheets as clear and simple as possible. to make sure your worksheet is clearly laid out so it's easy to use. So that means having the columns at the top all consistent, as we mentioned before. And I usually have a setting sheet where if it's a model, I can set there what's the first year and what's the last actual month. So each of the columns with the months in, it will automatically identify what period type it is. Is it an actual period or is it a plan period? So any period, any months up to the date you've just input as the last actual month, they will be shown as actual, and thereafter they are plan periods. And those period types and period names, that's right, January 24 and so on, those are linked to all of the other sheets. And you can use that on the calculation sheets to say, okay, if the period is an actual, then take the number from the actual sheet, or if it's not, then do your calculation to do the plan figure. And then from the vertical structure, if you've got the profit and loss account, the balance sheet, and the cash flow, then to do depends how you do it. If you've only got one company, I tend to put the calculations for the each of the P&L and balance sheet items on a separate sheet. I call them value drivers. If you've got lots of companies, I put them underneath the balance sheet, underneath the P&L and balance sheet, and then just clearly label the sections. So here is the financial statements. Then I group the lines together. You can open or close them. Then you've got the value drivers for the profit and loss account. Then you've got the value drivers for the accounts, for the balance sheet, the asset side, and the balance sheet, liabilities and equity side. So that makes it very clear. And having these groupings, I'm also a big fan of groupings. You can group them, you can close them, open them at the click of a button, just to quickly get to the section you want.
Everything instead of group it?
No, I don't like that. No, don't hide things, and don't put white on white. That's what some people do.
Yes, or you use, my favorite is the very hidden. If you go in, right?
Very hidden, yes.
And you can make your sheet very hidden. That's correct. Always a fun one.
Yeah. I sometimes do that on client models where we've had sheets, we've had interface sheets, which they shouldn't touch, but for some reason they unhide them and play around with them. And then...
Yes. I think that's the one situation where I agree with you, that sometimes you're like, I just don't want them to find it. I'll know they'll never see it.
Yeah.
I can get at it when I want. I just hate when you get a model and you're trying to figure everything out and you finally discover, oh, there's this very hidden sheet.
That's why if you're doing model reviews or you're taking over a model from someone else and you're amending it or extending it, it's always good to use a tool to run through it. I have used, obviously, Oak, for example. That's probably the most well-known one, Operis Analysis Kit.
Yep.
Oak for short. But I was, some of the things weren't what I wanted, so I went away and wrote my own version. So I use that. I call it Checkmate. So that's the next time. The next tip is use a clear, clean, consistent design. So you want to make sure that the whole workbook has a clean, professional look and feel, so that people, when they open it, they can see immediately, this looks professional. I'm very happy to use this. I've immediately got a good feeling that this is a reliable model. So obviously it doesn't change any of the formulas, but it does make the users more comfortable in using it. And things like not having lots of colors. So restricting yourself. If I'm building a model for a client, I ask them, or I look on their website, what's the color scheme, and try and make the color scheme similar or the same. I can extract what are the the red, blue, green codes from the logo and use those in Excel to set up a theme and use those. Obviously, you have to be careful with clients if they have a red or orange logo that's a strong color. You have to be careful about not overusing that, especially because red normally is used for warnings. So if you have too much red in your worksheet and your workbook, it looks like there's too many warnings going on, when really you're just trying to use their color scheme. And things like clearly marking input cells. So I said before, you need to clearly separate the inputs and the calculations and the outputs, ideally by putting them on different sheets. And if you've got, for example, the actual P&L and balance sheet data, that can definitely go on a separate sheet. But when you're looking at value drivers to calculate how much sales do I think I'm going to make in the future years, then often it's useful to have the assumptions on the same sheet. So how much percentage growth, for example, do I expect for either the total sales, or separate the price and the quantities, separate them out. It's useful to have those on the same sheet. You can put them on an assumption sheet, but I find that you have to then spend time going backwards and forwards between the assumption sheet and the calculation sheet too much. It's more convenient to have them all in one place. And then, especially in these cases, it's very important to clearly mark the input cells. I use a grey background with a white border, so that users are very clear where can they change things and where they shouldn't change. So if it's not grey with a grey background, then they should leave it alone. So either for inputs, and another big thing I'm keen on is using data validation to, where possible, to restrict the inputs. So if you're expecting only positive numbers in this cell, and then you can restrict it so that they can only enter a positive number. So if you want, for example, if you want a month number, when should these payments be made? When should the dividends be paid out each year? You can restrict them to entering a whole number between 1 and 12. Yeah. So simple things like that. But they can really, if you do want to later prevent users changing any other cells, in the formatting, I use cell styles a lot. So I can click on a cell, this is an input cell, and use a cell style and say this is the input style. And in that, it's not just the colors, but also the protection. So we say that cell is unprotected, which means if you then later protect the whole workbook, those cells which are gray input cells, those are still available for users to input. Okay, so that's the design questions. And obviously there's a lot more of that which I go into my book, but those are the key principles. And then the last two best practice rules, or golden ground rules, I call them, is number 4, restrict access, inputs, and changes. So you make sure that users can only access and change your spreadsheet. So that relates to what I just mentioned. One thing is you can restrict the access so they can only change the input cells. And obviously if it's particularly if it's got confidential information or only certain users should access the file, then make sure you store it in a folder that only the relevant users have access to. If necessary, put a password on it. But we also have to remember the password protection is not foolproof. You can get access to it, but it helps to some extent to restrict access.
In today's business world, financial modeling skills are more important than ever. With Financial Modeling Institute's Advanced Financial Modeler Accreditation Program, you can become recognized as an expert in the field by validating your financial modeling skills. Join the Financial Modeling Institute's community of top financial modelers, gain access to extensive learning resources, and attain the prestigious Advanced Financial Modeler Accreditation. Visit www.fminstitute.com/podcast and use code podcast to save 15% when you register. Funny story with that real quick. I had a professor in college that had built this super complex model in Excel, and he had perfected everything. And I remember at the time, and I think it's been fixed next, I opened it. I think it was in Apache Office or one of the free open source Office tools, and it cracked the password, basically.
Yeah.
It was no longer protected when I opened it in that. And I remember telling him, and the look on his face was like, "You're kidding me, right?" Like, no, but it's really helpful to see all your detail behind this. And he just...
Yes.
So yeah, I agree with you. They're not, by no means are they foolproof. If somebody wants to hack them, they can find a way.
They can find them, correct, yes. So just be aware of that. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, is to write instructions for the users. If it's a tool which is going to be used and regularly updated, you need to make sure the users know how to use it. So in most of my models and tools, I have a sheet called instructions, where it just lists in the column, first column has a hyperlink to the relevant sheet. Then it tells you next column what should you have to do there. And then I have a column with a drop down which says what's the status, is it to do or is it done? And then when they click on done, it goes to green, and they can quickly look there. And also if someone's started it and not finished it, they can always go back and say, yeah, that's where I got to. They know where they left off. So that's certainly something I would always recommend. And if it's any degree of complexity, more than the basic model, then give a training at the end for the users. Make sure they know how to use it. Give them the tips and tricks, tell them what to look out for, what to do, what not to do. So those are my 5 golden rules. Yeah. So I've developed those over a number of years, from practice, and I find they've still be in good stead.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing those. Make a lot of sense to me. There's one thing I really liked in there is just the importance of keeping it simple. I mean, there are a number of different things, but it's very easy, especially early on. I still find myself guilty of it, to make something more complex than it needs to be.
Yes. I think some people like to show off it to show that they can calculate a lot of steps in one cell. And I prefer to split them over several lines. So that you can each step is then clearer, simpler, easy to understand, less risk of errors, and you can change it more easily. So it takes up more space, but as I was fond of saying, Excel doesn't charge you by the line. so you can take those extra few lines to make the calculations clearer.
I agree with you. If it makes it easier for everybody to understand, just break it out. At the end of the day, there's no reason to try to save space. I like that. That doesn't charge by the line.
Exactly. So when I'm writing a formula, I try and follow the priorities. The first one is that the result is correct. That's obviously it has the top priority, or sometimes say it has to be materially correct. So I think you can use a simplifying, because normally when I'm talking about planning numbers, you're never going to hit that plan number anyway. You're never going to hit it on the nose. So if you can make the calculation a bit simpler, it's not then wrong. It's just a simpler calculation logic. And if it's still good enough, then you can make the logic simpler. That's easier to understand, less risk of errors. I think that's something you can certainly do. And then the second priority is then making it easy to understand. And that's where the step comes in, spreading calculations if necessary over multiple lines. And the third one is getting it short. So you shouldn't give priority to getting it short or getting it all in one cell over the other two priorities. And sometimes I use this the rule of thumb. So that means your formula shouldn't be longer than your thumb.
Yeah, I've heard that one before. The kind of rule of thumb idea is keep it as short as you can.
Keep it as short as you can, exactly. And if you need it longer, then spread it over multiple rows. And obviously with things like dynamic arrays, that helps you in this respect.
Pretty amazing what you can do with them.
Yes, I continue to be amazed when I see and I look at videos on YouTube and so on to see what people are doing with them. You can do some pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah, I agree with you. I've seen some things people do, and I'm like, I would have never thought of doing that. Some of the formulas people write, it's pretty amazing what they can get Excel to do.
So I think there's no worry that Excel is going to die anytime soon.
I agree with you, despite what some people might say on LinkedIn.
Correct. Yeah, because the same with AI and Copilot. That's just going to write the spreadsheets for you. No, I don't think so. I think it's could end up in that situation in the future sometime, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. It can certainly support you. That's very good, but you need to have the background in understanding what is the challenge that the client has or the user has that you need to solve with this model or workbook, and to make the right design choices to get the right data that you need, and so on and so forth.
I agree with you. I mean, Copilot's going to help us. Yes, there are areas where it can write things, can do work for us, but it's not going to take our jobs. There's a role for us in all of this. And we still need to understand what we're doing. In fact, I think in some ways, the people who use AI and take advantage of it the best are those that really understand the processes.
Yes, correct.
Because those that don't understand anything and just try to use it to do everything. It's an exciting time for sure on that front. But I have another query, kind of going back to your book before we move on. I have one more question I want to ask around that. So in the book, you provided 20 real-life horror stories.
Correct.
Was there a common theme across those horror stories? Like, did you find some common themes that came out from those horror stories?
Yes, so I split them into different sections, the different kinds of errors which occurred, but I think we can basically split them into two groups: errors which were errors in the spreadsheet itself, so formulas wrong or whatever, or user errors. Quite a lot were in the area of user errors. So copy and pasting was done incorrectly, or even on the grounds of confidentiality, things were sent out and they had confidential information. So perhaps can I mention a couple?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so there was one which doctor job offers. So the National Health Service in Britain used spreadsheets for assessing the doctors which they had for interviews, and they used them to capture the interview results and to then determine which doctors or which interviewees were going to get a job offer. And they copied the results across from each of the interviews into a master spreadsheet, but that didn't happen properly, correctly, and that they were in different formats. That's also another key point when I mentioned it before. Consistency is key. If you're going to copy data from one spreadsheet to another, make sure that the format is consistent. Spend the time before you send things out to make sure that you've got all the data you need, all consistent formats. You can do that, either copy paste, or nowadays probably you can use Power Queries better. But anyway, this time they didn't do that. The format of the spreadsheets which they got back from the various interviews was a different format. When they copied and pasted, they made various errors, which meant basically the upshot was that some interviewees got rejections when they were actually very good, and the other way around. Yeah,
definitely
so that's not
a problem good. There.
Yeah, okay. So basically, you need to, and when you're copying and pasting, in this case it was results, but if you're copying and pasting formulas, you need to be aware of that can also create, even if in the source that was not an error, when you copy it across to another error, if you've got the cell fixing incorrect, then that can also give you incorrect. And then there was the big one, the London whale case, which probably the one which had the biggest losses, over $6 billion of losses. That was JP Morgan used a spreadsheet model to determine the value at risk for its credit portfolio. Something that's very technical in nature, and the $6 billion, which was apparently lost, was also due to fines. It wasn't only due to the spreadsheet errors, but spreadsheet errors were a component of it. And in calculating value at risk, they apparently added two numbers instead of taking the average. So it sounds quite a simple error, but it had a big impact. And it's the point I would make here is that it's a complicated error. So when you're developing any calculation, you need to be aware, do you understand what it is that you're modeling? So I invented the Warren Buffett rule of modeling. So Warren Buffett's famous rule of investing is only invest in what you understand. And I amended that for modeling to say only model what you understand. So in this case, the subject value at risk is a technical. You need to make sure you understand it before you try and do the modeling for it. Otherwise, you're going to get, you could have a high risk of errors. And obviously, always test. I'm also a big fan of testing. That's another key way to avoid or detect errors. Test each individual calculation, then test it in the next biggest block. So test your sales calculation, then test your P&L. Does the profit look correct? And then test that when it's flowing into the cash flow and so on. Does everything look okay? And if it's a really complicated model and very important to be used for a very important decision, then get someone else to check it as well. As I say, some of the errors were in the model itself. There's some where people added up ranges and they missed out some of the lines. So simple errors like that, but they can have big results, big impacts on the decisions made, and have caused financial loss and also loss of reputation. So it's not always just a financial loss. Obviously, these entities suffer from a loss of reputation as well. What I found it a bit sad was in researching for the book that there wasn't often the technical details behind what was the actual error. So in the news stories, when they're presented, they're often presented from the shock horror. There was a big error and it cost this much loss of earnings or whatever, or this much fine. But what was the error that actually occurred? And it's only in a few cases which we have the details for that. But certainly you can identify some basic principles which basically match up to my golden ground rules of the way you should work to try and avoid them. And one that also came up a number of times and also quite recently was and I mentioned this here so that your users are aware of it, in a pivot table. If you've got a pivot table, you can drill down by double clicking on any cell and it shows you all the data behind it. And so, but a lot of people don't seem to know this. And if the data behind is confidential, you think you send someone the pivot table, they can't see the data behind it. Oh, yes, they can. They double click. So a number of organizations have been fined for this very fact, where someone double clicked and found the information behind with personal information which they shouldn't have been able to see.
Yeah, all the data is stored there, and so that's a good reminder to people.
The trick is there. If you want to send the information out that's in a pivot table, don't send a pivot table, send a PDF of it. So obviously you lose the functionality of the pivot table, but that's the safest way to protect confidential information.
A great reminder there. I like that one because yes, it's easy to if you're not careful, send out data that will get you in trouble.
Correct. Yes. And perhaps just to end on one of my favorite sayings. So having lived in Germany, there's a favorite saying of mine in Germany: "Trust is good, but control is better." So I'm always a very keen fan of putting checks in models, collating them all on a master check sheet, and then adding them all up. So I write my checks that a result of 0 means no error identified. So the typical example is you take the sum of the assets side of the balance sheet, deduct the sum of the other side, the equity and liabilities, and if the difference is 0, then your balance sheet balances, and you can send that through to a master check sheet. And then if you add them all up, all the checks up, and their total is 0, then you haven't identified any issues. So that's great. And you can send that result, checks okay, throughout the whole model, which means if on any sheet you do something which creates an error, you can immediately see it. I always have my eye up at the top left of each sheet to see if the checks remain okay. And if not, then you know that what you just did caused the error. So it helps you find it much more quickly. So that's something definitely recommend doing.
Yeah, definitely having a good process for error checking is really important. Totally agree with you on that. Appreciate you sharing some of those horror stories. Couple more questions here, and then we're going to move to the rapid fire section where we get to put you on the spot. So I'm curious, going to kind of change gears on you here a little bit. What's your favorite Excel shortcut? What's your go-to or the one you like the most?
Okay, the one I have two, F2 and F4.
Yes.
F2 is edit because I'm always editing that, and F4 because it has two things. If you're writing a formula with a cell reference, you click F4. It puts the dollar signs in it to fix it.
Yep.
Or if you're not editing a formula, it just repeats what you just did. So that's great. So
I haven't used it for the second one. I use it all the time for the dollars.
Yeah, exactly.
Good. That is a great one. I appreciate both of those. And then I
like that because you just press F4 and you get more dollars. That's great.
I'll have to remember that. Well, what's the one I've heard? What do gold diggers and Excel references have in common?
No, you lost me on that one. Tell me.
If you want them to stay in place, you have to throw money at them.
Ah, okay. Yeah, very good.
So there you go.
Yeah.
That's one I heard the other day. Next question we'll ask you here. As you look back over your career, what's the one thing you've learned that's helped you the most in being more productive? What's that kind of one lesson you'd share?
Yeah, so I think shortcuts, which you just mentioned, but in the recent years, Power Query, definitely.
I love me some Power Query. It can save you a huge amount of time.
Yes.
I was doing some training this last week, and the one guy's like, I have this process. It's a nightmare. And he starts explaining to me. I'm like, are you familiar with Power Query? He's like, no. I'm like, you should be able to reduce that at least 95%, possibly get it to a press a button. And he looked at me and he's like, we could do that. I could kiss you. And I have a training partner. I go, well, you can kiss Ron if you want. But, because he was just so excited. Like, you mean I could take something from 6 hours and get it to where it takes me a minute or two?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you set it up right, you can.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And unpivot. If I click of a button, unpivot. That's great.
I love me some on pivot. Yeah, it's also another fun one. People's eyes light up like, oh, I can do that easy? Big fan of Power Query. All right, so we're going to move to rapid fire. I know you've
very good.
Before.
Yes, I have, and I'm looking forward to it.
I'll lay out the ground rules just to make sure we're on the same page. You get no more than 15 seconds to answer each of these. You can't tell me it depends. Then at the end, you can elaborate our one or two, because I realize there's nuance to many of these. It's usually not as simple as one or the other. Mm-hmm. So we'll get started here. First one, circular or no circular references?
No circular.
VBA or no VBA?
No VBA.
Horizontal or vertical model?
Horizontal.
All right. Dynamic arrays in your model, yes or no?
Financial model, no.
Okay. External workbook links, yes or no?
No.
All righty. Named ranges in your model or no named ranges?
A few, yes.
That's usually what we get, kind of a few. Be sparing with it. Do you follow a formal standards board for your modeling? Yes or no?
No.
I figured you followed Gary's ground rules.
Correct. That's right.
Will Excel ever die?
No.
All righty. Will AI build the models for us in the future?
Yes.
I know there's nuance to that one. I could tell by the way you're like, I answer this one. All right. Use of sheet cell protection in your models, yes or no?
Yes.
All righty. Do you believe financial models are the number one corporate decision-making tool?
Yes, definitely.
All right. And then the last one, what's your lookup function of choice? You like choose, VLOOKUP, index match, XLOOKUP, or something else?
Index match.
Okay, great. Which one would you like to elaborate on of those that you answered? I know there are a couple that you paused for a minute.
Yeah, I mean, the circular references, we're talking there about the circular reference, what I call logical circular references, where you have interest on the bank loan, so that means you need more bank loan, which means you have more interest and so on. So those kind of things. I think if you have monthly periods, I prefer not to have them. I just calculate the interest based upon the opening balance plus any drawdowns and maybe any repayments, but not the average of the opening and closing balance to avoid circular references. And I've done simple models to calculate to see what the effect is, and you can see the effect depending obviously on the model, but it's not so great. Where I do see a need for it is if you have annual periods, because there the values can change dramatically over the period of a year. And if you just take the opening balance, you can end up certainly in the first year where you take up the loan, you've then got no interest unless you take the opening balance plus the drawdowns. Okay, so in that circumstance, there could be a need to use some kind of circularity, and then obviously you've got the choice. You can either turn on the iterations. I'm not such a big fan of that, because if you then introduce a second circular reference which was unintentional and not wanted, you won't spot it so easily. Or you can use a macro to do the copy paste. So you haven't removed the circularity, you just controlled it a bit. I mean, basically it ends up with a copy paste macro. It just does what Excel does in the background if you turn the iterations on. You're just making it giving the control to the user and making sure that there's no other undesired circular references in there.
Sure. I know a lot of people use macros, kind of control that environment.
And then I was going to say to the macros, I am a big fan of macros, but not for calculations. I use macros for things like if you need to create an output sheet which needs to be uploaded to the system, then click on the button, it just creates the sheet in the CSV format that the upload system needs, and then that's it. And maybe for hiding sheets, which we spoke about hiding sheets earlier, but sometimes for certain end users, it's easier for them if they see less sheets. They only see the sheets which they need to see for the inputs or the outputs. That's easier for them to manage than seeing all the 20 sheets in the model. They only see the 3 or 4 which they need to see.
Yep, makes sense. Well, I appreciate you kind of running through those, sharing your thoughts on that. Always fun to get different people's perspectives. I don't think I've had 2 people answer every single question the same yet, right? There's always a little bit of diversity and nuance in thought. And that's so true in modeling. If it was simple and the exact same for everybody, we wouldn't all have our own set of rules that are similar, but slightly different. Because like I say, it's an art and a science. And Correct. you gotta get both sides of those right. So kind of speaking of that, as we wrap up here, I've enjoyed our interview. I want to ask you, what's one piece of advice you would share with our audience if they want to be a better financial modeler today? What should they focus on?
Well, certainly getting trained early. Not try and learn it yourself, but take some formal training course so you can learn the basics. Yeah. So it's the same with anything you're doing, even with sports or whatever you want to learn. Get the basics under your belt first of all, so you can work with the best practice and not start off learning wrong things, do it the wrong way.
I wish I had done that. That was definitely something I didn't have at the beginning of my career. So it took a long time for me to develop good habits, but that's another story. So last question for you. If our audience wants to learn more about you or get in touch, what's the best way for them to do that?
So I think basically follow me on LinkedIn. So you can send me a contact or a request, or just follow me. I'm posting every week with tips and tricks there. I do have a website I have 2 websites, not-consulting.com, but that's very much static. And I also have an Excel tips spreadsheet website called howtoexcel.com. Mostly I would say just connect with me or follow me on LinkedIn, and then you see my weekly tips and my comments if you'll follow me.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining the show, Gary. Enjoyed chatting with you today and look forward to sharing this with the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and the chance to speak with you. I find it very, very good, very enlightening. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Have a good day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Financial Modelers Corner was brought to you by Financial Modeling Institute. Visit FMI at www.fminstitute.com/podcast and use code PODCAST to save 15% when you enroll in one of their accreditations today.